There are 3 specific features that the Canon R5 Mark II needed to have in order for it to be a worthwhile upgrade from the original R5. So did we get those features, or does the Canon R5 Mark II have any deal breakers? Deal breaker number 1, if you've seen any video footage shot on the Canon R5 or the Canon R6, then you know about the jello effect, the corner ibis wobbles that you would typically get when shooting with a wide angle lens like a 15mm or a 16mm, or in my case, if I was to do any vlogging with the 15-35 where I'm kind of moving around, then you would notice it. But you would also notice it on a 24mm lens when doing handheld effects, where all of a sudden the sensor would kind of just shift around very unpredictably. Now, a month ago, I made a short where I said that this was something that absolutely needed to be fixed. And it seems like Canon listened, because they now have something called coordinated control image stabilization that helps achieve the optimum handshake correction effects, benefiting handheld shooting in low light conditions and reducing shake when recording videos. So deal breaker number 1, absolutely solved. But there are 2 more deal breakers, and over the last 48 hours since this camera has been announced, I have been out shooting a campaign with the original R5. My cameras are okay now, but they were absolutely covered in dust until a few hours ago when I cleaned them off. But I've been talking to a ton of photographers, video creators on both sides, Canon shooters and Sony shooters, just to kind of get an idea of what features were they expecting with this camera. Is there anything, there's actually one person I know who said there were enough features inside the R5 II to actually switch from Sony to Canon, but I'm not gonna call them out because I'm sure people will get upset. But is the IBIS control enough, or is it simply Canon playing catch up? Because I know for me, there are at least 2 more features that I wanted to see inside of the Canon R5 Mark II. If we take a look at the body design, it is very similar to the R5, but Canon has pretty much put everything we asked for. We now have a full-size HDMI. We have a tally light, which to me says this is very much a video-centric camera, but we'll talk a little bit more about those features in a bit. It has venting, both active and passive cooling, so you can get the grip, which allows you to shoot for longer, which is absolutely awesome. We do have new batteries, which some people won't like, but it also means we get better performance and more photos out of this camera. One thing for me that's kind of missing is the fact that they didn't really change the tilty flippy screen. It's pretty much the same design. I don't think it was necessary to do a Sony A7R type flippy, tilty, crazy screen. I've shot on similar cameras and haven't really found too much of a like, I don't feel like I'm missing that feature. But one thing I was hoping to see was the straightening of the screen, because Canon screens have kind of always just stuck out at a slightly weird angle, but they apparently still flip out at a slightly weird angle. It does also have a 14-bit electronic shutter, which is huge, which means now you can shoot silently and not worry about losing detail in the shadows. 30 frames per second, pre-shooting, a faster sensor, eye control, autofocus, improved ISO, which we would all expect after 4 years. It has some like neural noise reduction and upscaling, which I don't know how I feel about this. One of the features that they added to the R5 partway through its life cycle was the IBIS stitch mode. And if you go back to the video I posted a year ago about my R5 II wish list, one of the things I said is that I would love that feature, but to have it in RAW, where it effectively just outputs one single RAW photo for you. But instead, they've done a 180 megapixel like up resing, which maybe there's an argument to be made that it's better than what Lightroom can do, but Lightroom, as far as I remember, will output an actual RAW file, whereas the Canon R5 II just spits out a JPEG. So maybe they'll update this in a firmware or add some sort of like Canon utility that you can do it in RAW, but for me right now, that's not really a selling point. The autofocus improvements seem to be amazing. There's face recognition, which apparently has been in Sony cameras for a while, where you can find a face or take a photo of a face and save it and tell the autofocus, hey, prioritize this face. So maybe you're shooting photos for an event and there's a speaker and you always want to capture their face, or there's multiple people in a room and it's a wedding and you want to make sure the bride and the groom are registered, then you can kind of set that so the camera knows to always prioritize those faces. So nothing too crazy on the photo front. But then what about video? For me, one of the things that absolutely suffers in the R5 and the R6 II is the fact that it can only shoot in C-Log 3. And while that allows me to pull more out of my footage in terms of like editing it later, one of the problems with C-Log 3 is that the shadows, they're not clipped, but they're very noisy, very muddy. And so if you ever underexposed and tried to like bump the exposure later in your editing software, it would just be a mess. There'd be way too much noise and the footage would effectively be unrecoverable. So now they've added not only C-Log 2, but they've improved the dynamic range and they've added some sort of like noise enhancing. It seems like they've found a way to improve the details in the shadows to the point where having something like a dual base native ISO almost doesn't matter, which is a feature I know a lot of video shooters are looking for. And in the R5, while it wasn't officially stated, if you went from 800 ISO all the way up to 3200 ISO, 3200, even though being a higher ISO, would be cleaner than 2000 ISO. And some people would argue that's just like a hidden feature inside the Canon cameras, but it wasn't ever really listed as a dual base native ISO option for video. We do get more codec options, similar to what we've seen in the R5C. I think there's some things going on there that people maybe aren't realizing because they've also added proxy files, no recording limit. If you've used any GoPros in the last like 5 years, they also have added auto leveling. So this is a feature that's borrowed from the Canon R7 where effectively if your camera was just slightly off, you could turn on auto leveling and the camera would basically adjust the horizon to be perfectly flat. So now that's in the Canon R5 Mark II. 8K RAW, 60 frames per second, 4K SRAW, which is nice because sometimes you don't want to shoot 8K RAW if you're just in a 4K timeline for that project. Well, now you can shoot RAW video in a lower resolution. 1080p, 240 frames per second, and 120p with audio, false color, zebras, waveforms, 4-channel audio, 10-bit regular video profile. So if you don't want to shoot in log, you can still get the flexibility of a 10-bit file and kind of just those standard Canon color profiles. There's now pre-shooting both in video and in photo mode, so you can either capture a few frames before hitting the shutter or a few seconds before hitting the shutter. This is something that we've seen in other Canon cameras, but all of these features combined, especially on the video side, make me believe that this is effectively a combination of the R5 and the R5C to the point where the R5C2 just won't be a camera. They're not gonna make that product. And while this might alienate or isolate some of the more cinema-centric shooters, I think this is a very welcomed improvement or product segmentation strategy where maybe before you were confused of whether or not to buy the R5 or the R5C, and now that you just effectively have one option other than jumping up to something like a C70 or some of the actual cinema cameras, it makes the decision a lot easier, because I think something Canon was doing before was segmenting their market. So deal breaker number 3 for me is the fact that the line of cameras that Canon is offering no longer feels segmented. I don't feel like there's a feature that I'm missing out on, whereas before, maybe I didn't have certain video modes or I didn't have certain codec options, but now that they've effectively added all of those little things that make the Canon R5 II more appropriate for hybrid shooters and for video shooters, it's a camera that I'm gonna feel a lot more comfortable with, which is one of the reasons why I've pre-ordered it. I have not tested it, but I have put my own money down to say, hey, look, I'm committed to this. Everything that I've wanted, if you go back to any of the videos that I've posted in the past of, hey, this is what the Canon R5 needs, this is the things that need to change, Canon has pretty much done it. I actually put a poll out on Threads and on Instagram on my stories and asked, is there anything that you didn't get that you expected to see in the R5 Mark II? And the only thing mentioned that was consistent was global shutter, which I understand, but also if you look at the Sony A9 Mark III, it's kind of been like Sony's biggest failure in the sense that it hasn't sold as well as they thought. It's a very expensive camera for what you're getting. It's kind of like a niche product for sports, high-speed shooters, and I think we're still at the point that most of us won't benefit from the global shutter Now, why the R1 doesn't have a global shutter, that's maybe a little bit more of a mystery, but I think for the working photographer who maybe is already all right with the R5, I know I'm someone who has been getting a ton of use out of my R5 and is okay with it. I don't really need too many major upgrades at this point other than just tweaking the little things. Maybe open gate? Can we add open gate to the R5 II? That would be nice. But if there's a feature I missed or you think there's something in the R5 II that you want to see, let me know down in the comments because hopefully some people from Canon watch this and get some ideas. Maybe they'll even fix it in a firmware update. Maybe they will give open gate to us or some other feature that I haven't thought of. And until the next one, if you want to see more videos like this, check out these 2 videos here and grab your camera and go shoot photos.